All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on evolution, and we're specifically going to go through and look at morphology today. Let's get started on this next video. So what is morphology? Well, morphology is the study of body forms, so the bones, the limbs, the teeth, and this field of science can tell us a lot about evolution from common descent. So if we think back to our old video, we have to go through and remember cladograms and phylogenetic trees. Here we have a frog, we have a robin, and then we're going to have a bluebird. And looking at this cladogram, well, which individuals are more related? If we look at this very simply, well, we can definitely see the robin and the bluebird are more related. And we don't necessarily need a cladogram for this. We can see that they're very similar looking, so we know that the robin and the bluebird are more common based on the morphology than the frog. So from the diagram, we can see that this bluebird is more closely related to the robin. And again, we're looking at these two pictures here. We can see that they are very similar shape. They both have beaks, they both have feathers. The colors are different, but they are going to exhibit very similar traits. Now, if we're looking at this tree frog here, right, the tree frog really doesn't look that similar to the birds. And we can, again, tell this based on morphology. Now, what we're going to delve into are what we call homologous and analogous structures here. And we really have to understand how this goes through and functions. So let's go through the definition of comparative anatomy first, and then we'll understand what homologous structure is. Now, comparative anatomy is the study of similarities and differences in the structures of different species. Now, if we look at the diagram on the left here, what we see is a human arm, and we're looking at the bone structure here. So starting at the top, we have the humerus, the radius, the ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals, and then we have the phalanges. And if we look at these, we can see that each of these bone structures goes through and connects and makes up that arm. Now, if we go through and look at a dog here, we can see that those same bone structures exist. We have a humerus, a radius, an ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. So if we're looking at this, these same bone structures go through and exist within the dog, a dolphin, and then we also see it in a fruit bat here. All of these same bones, they're connected in the same way. Size of the bones might be a little bit different, but the connection and the same type of bones exist. Now, a homologous structure here is a similar organ or a similar bone structure that is shared amongst different taxa or different species. And what this is going to suggest to us is, well, if we have these similar bone structures here, it must mean that these individuals are from a common ancestor that have diverged and evolved over time that have allowed for the same bones to exist in a human, a dog, a dolphin, and a fruit bat. So if we're thinking about the definition of a homologous structure, well, homologous structures are the structures that are similar in related organisms because they were inherited from a common ancestor here. So if we're looking at maybe lions, we can look at a dog and we can look at human teeth here. Well, are these individuals related based on the morphology? And the answer here is yes. And what we can see is bears, cats, humans, and dogs all have teeth that are remarkably similar, and we can see this in homologous structures. If we look at the lion, we see these large canines. We also see these canines in the dog, and if you go through and feel your teeth, if you go 1, 2, 3 teeth back, you can actually see that there are canines on your tooth structure as well. And we know that the lion, the dog, and the human, all of these are mammals. We know that they're related because they're mammals, but we can tell based on the morphology because they have similar tooth structure, similar bone structure, and a bunch of other things that we're going to go through and look at here. So homologous structures are structures that are similar in related organisms because they're inherited from that common ancestor. Now, let's say we're looking at this diagram here, and we're looking at organ similarities instead of skeletal similarities now. So we have our human heart here, and we have a turtle heart here. And what we can see is the homologous structures in play again. So what we see here, in this case, we have a 4-chambered versus a 3-chambered heart, but we still see the similarities. We have an aorta, we have our pulmonary artery, we have our atria here, and then we also have our ventricles. Now, if we're looking at this, there are 2 separate ventricle chambers here, whereas we only have 1 over here. When we look at our cladogram on the next slide, this will go through and make sense. But again, homologous structures, what this is indicating is the similarity between the mechanical structures of these 2 organs is going to indicate that there is some sort of common ancestor because of the existence of these 4 structures here. Now, if we look at the cladogram here, we have a reptile, we have birds, and we have mammals here. And what we can see here is that the common ancestor previous to birds and mammals led to the rise of the four-chambered heart. So if we look at birds and mammals, they both have four-chambered hearts. Reptiles and amphibians sometimes have two and sometimes have three-chambered hearts. And where the four-chambered heart, we can see where it's located on the cladogram. What this cladogram is indicating, if we go through and read it, is there's a common ancestor after reptiles but before birds and mammals that leads to the rise of this four-chambered heart. And because of the structure of the heart, we can see that the bird and the mammals are related because, again, they have a homologous structure, or a structure that is mechanically similar between the two, that is going to indicate that they share a common ancestor. Now, the other thing that we have to go through and learn about are analogous structures. Students are commonly going to think that this is just the opposite of homologous structures, and that's not necessarily the case. It's a little more nuanced than that. Analogous structures are structures that are similar in unrelated organisms. So if we're looking at this, butterfly and bat wings here. Well, both of the organisms have wings, and both of these organisms have independently evolved wings to allow them to fly and survive. However, they do not share a common ancestors here. So many creatures evolve flight because the power of flight basically allows for a variety of different advantages. It allows you to travel longer distances over shorter periods of time. So these wing-like flaps are very, very useful. In the case of a bat, it allows them to go through and collect more insects and food. In the case of the butterfly, it allows them to travel from flower to collect nectar. Now, if we're looking at another example here to really make sure that this makes sense, well, we can look at eyes. We have a cat eye here, and then we have an octopus eye. Now, if we look at the cat eye, it's very different than a human eye. Same thing with the octopus eye. Cat eye has this very interesting slit going right down the middle of the eye. And this slit is moving vertical. Now, if we look at the octopus eye, this is going to have a horizontal slit. Now, the human eye has what we call a pupil, and it's this circular opening in the eye. And that's very different than the cat eye and the octopus eye. Now, if we look at these and we look at the similarities between the two, well, both the octopus and the cat have great, well-developed eyes. And if we look at cuttlefish and octopus eyes, they're actually more complex and allow the organism to see better than human eyes. Now, their common ancestor did not have eyes, and the eyes evolved independently of each lineage here. So cat eyes evolved independently, and the octopus eyes evolved independently. And the thing that we have to understand here is it doesn't mean that they share the common ancestor here. It means that the development of these eyes allowed them to go through and be more productive in the environment that they're going through and evolving for, and be more fit. And as a result, they evolve independently. Same thing with the wings. Now, the other way that we can go through and think about this is what we call evolutionary convergence. So if we're thinking about this, evolutionary convergence is the independent evolution of similar traits. So creatures that are not really that closely related have evolved similar traits. Now, if we're thinking about this, this is not evolutionary convergence here. This is where we have a common ancestor that's going to arise and allow for two individual separate species here to have similar traits. In this case, we have a mammoth and we have an elephant, and I realize mammoths are no longer roaming the earth and are extinct, so this might not be the best example, but in this case, they both share a common ancestor here. Now, if we're talking about evolutionary convergence, let's think about the butterfly, the bird, and the bat. They don't have a recent common ancestor. So if we're thinking about this, the butterfly evolved the wings independently from an ancestor, the bird from another ancestor, and the bat from another ancestor. And what wings are is they're really allowing these individuals to be fit in different environments because wings are so powerful for the fitness of those organisms. And we can actually see the power of evolution at play for things like legs and wings and common features amongst all of these species because it allows them to be fit within their environment. So if we think about this, evolutionary convergence, and we're talking about analogous structures here, we're talking about independent ancestors and independent evolution of these similar traits. So if we're comparing the two of these, just so we're super clear, we can think about homologous and analogous structures here. So remember, a homologous structure are structures that are similar in related organisms because they're inherited from a common ancestor. Analogous structures are structures that are similar in unrelated organisms. So in this case, homologous structures are similar in structure. We're thinking about canines in lions, dogs, and humans. We can see the similarity in the canine structure of the teeth. Now, analogous structures are going to have the same function, but they're going to be a little bit different. The bat wing and the butterfly wing both are wings, but the overall mechanical structure of those two wings is different. They've evolved independently, there's different bones and there's different structures that allow for those wings to go through and arise. Now, homologous structures are going to differ in function in some cases, whereas analogous structures are going to be similar in function. An example that we can think about this is if we look at the bone structures amongst a dolphin, a dog, and a bat and a human. Well, the bat, we have the same bone structure, but the bat wing allows them to fly. In the case of the dolphin, it's going to be as a flipper to allow them to paddle in the water. And then the hand and the leg of the dog are going to allow it to walk on a terrestrial environment. Now, if we look at the bat and the butterfly wing, they're both giving that individual organism the ability to fly. Now, lastly here, in a homologous structure, this is the big one, it comes from a common ancestor here. So it's coming from a common ancestor, whereas analogous structures are not coming from a common ancestor. All right, so did you guys learn? Well, did you learn a couple of things? Did you guys go through and learn about homologous structures? Did you learn about analogous structures? And then did you learn about the difference between the two? This is going to be the end of the video. I will see you all in class tomorrow.